What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks into what he thinks is a routine morning show interview, only to be ambushed by a host with a personal agenda? Samuel L. Jackson, a living legend with decades of iconic roles under his belt, arrived at the Good Morning America studio expecting nothing more than a light morning chat. Dressed in his signature black leather jacket and flashing that charismatic smile audiences knew so well, Jackson settled into the guest chair with ease. For him, this was just another promotional appearance. 10 minutes of casual banter, a few laughs, and a plug for his upcoming thriller. Across from him sat George Stephanopoulos, his usual authoritative tone and practiced smile hiding something more calculated. As the cameras rolled and the red lights came on, millions of viewers tuned in, expecting a friendly, straightforward interview. "We're back with Academy Award nominee Samuel L. Jackson," George began, his voice steady and professional. "Samuel, thank you for joining us this morning." "Always a pleasure, George," Jackson replied warmly. But something felt off. Jackson, ever perceptive, noticed the subtle tension in George's body language, the forced grin, the overly deliberate tone. There was a sharpness in the host's eyes, a signal that this conversation might not go the way anyone expected. "Of course, we'll talk about your new film," Stephanopoulos continued smoothly, shuffling his notes. "But I think our viewers would be more interested in some of the controversial statements you've made recently about Hollywood and certain media figures." The mood in the studio shifted instantly. Crew members exchanged uneasy glances. Audience members leaned forward, sensing trouble brewing. Jackson's smile faded slightly as his brow furrowed. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, George," Jackson said calmly, though his tone carried a quiet warning. "I came here to talk about my work, not to rehash headlines." George, unfazed, pressed on. "Well, last month you criticized how Hollywood treats veteran actors. You also said certain media personalities need to know their place. Those comments made quite a splash. Don't you think viewers deserve some clarification?" Jackson's eyes narrowed just a bit, an unmistakable sign for anyone familiar with his films. The audience could feel the tension spiking, as if they were watching the setup for an explosive movie scene. "George," Jackson said slowly, his voice low but firm, "I came here for a conversation about my craft, not to be interrogated about quotes ripped out of context." But George didn't back down. "Samuel, some people might view those comments as threatening. Were you talking about anyone specific?" The word threatening hit like a thunderclap. "Threatening?" Jackson repeated, his eyes locking on George with laser focus. The playful, laid-back demeanor was gone. In its place was the formidable intensity that had made him one of Hollywood's most commanding presences. The studio went silent. Every camera, every audience member, every crew member could sense it. This wasn't going to be just another interview. Samuel L. Jackson was about to take control. The studio air grew heavier with every passing second. George leaned forward, sensing an opportunity to push further. "Come on, Samuel. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You criticized executives. You called out media personalities. And you even said some journalists don't know their place. Those are strong words. Don't you think people deserve to know who you meant?" Jackson tilted his head slightly, that trademark piercing stare fixed on George. "What I think, George," he said slowly, "is that you invited me here under false pretenses. You made it seem like we'd have a conversation about my film. Instead, you're sitting here trying to turn this into a circus act for ratings." A ripple of murmurs swept through the live audience. Crew members exchanged anxious glances, fully aware they were witnessing a rare and raw television moment. George smirked faintly, mistaking Jackson's rising frustration for weakness. "Samuel, don't you think this reaction proves exactly the point I'm making about your temperament?" It was the wrong thing to say. Jackson leaned forward, his hands clasped, his voice dropping to a low, measured tone, the kind audiences recognized right before one of his legendary on-screen monologues. "Temperament? George, you're really going to lecture me about temperament while ambushing me on live television?" George's smirk faltered. The shift in the room was palpable. The confident morning host who usually controlled every interview was now dealing with a man who simply couldn't be manipulated. "You've been sitting behind that desk for years," Jackson continued, his voice rising slightly. Acting like your platform gives you the right to twist people's words. You think this little stunt is journalism? It's not. It's disrespect. And you know it. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. George adjusted his tie, the first real sign that his confidence was cracking. "I'm just doing my job," he replied, but his voice lacked the authority it had minutes earlier. Jackson chuckled, but there was no humor in it. If your job is to misquote people, ambush them, and try to create a viral moment at their expense, then congratulations. You're killing it. George tried to interject, but Jackson raised a hand, stopping him cold. "No, you don't get to hide behind the word journalism when what you're really doing is exploitation." The camera zoomed in on Jackson's face, calm, collected, and utterly commanding. He wasn't shouting, he didn't need to. His presence alone filled the studio. George, now visibly uncomfortable, attempted to regain control. "Samuel, I think we should just move on to your film." Jackson cut him off instantly. "Oh, now you want to talk about my film? After you spent the last 10 minutes trying to paint me as some unhinged celebrity? No, George. You don't get to decide when the conversation changes. Not anymore." The power dynamic had shifted completely. Viewers at home could feel it. Stephanopoulos, once the authority behind the desk, now looked small, cornered, outmatched, and utterly exposed. Jackson leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving George's. "You wanted to test my temperament, George. Well, guess what? You just found it." The studio was electric. Everyone knew this was only the beginning. The tension inside the studio was unbearable now. George Stephanopoulos shifted in his chair, the confident anchor facade cracking with each passing second. His usual smooth delivery was gone, replaced by a nervous stiffness that the cameras captured in merciless detail. "Samuel, you're overreacting," George tried, forcing a weak smile. "I'm just asking questions. Our viewers expect honesty." Jackson let out a short laugh, cold and sharp. "Honesty? Don't insult me, George. You didn't bring me here for honesty. You brought me here for a headline. You wanted a viral clip, and you thought I'd just sit here and let you twist my words so you could boost your ratings." The crew behind the cameras exchanged uneasy looks. They'd seen difficult interviews before, but nothing like this. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a reckoning. "You've been in this business long enough to know the game," Jackson continued, his voice rising just enough to fill every corner of the studio. "And you picked the wrong guest to play it with today." George tried to interject, but Jackson leaned forward, eyes blazing. "No, you had your chance to talk. Now you're going to listen." The audience gasped softly. They were witnessing a complete role reversal. The man who usually controlled the conversation with ease was now being dismantled, piece by one of Hollywood's most commanding voices. "You sit there every morning acting like you're some kind of authority," Jackson said, his voice cutting like a blade. "But authority isn't granted by a fancy suit and a teleprompter. Authority is earned through knowledge, through respect, something you clearly don't understand." George swallowed hard, his face paling under the bright studio lights. "Samuel, please." "No, George, not this time." Jackson's tone was final. "You don't get to ambush me and then hide behind a fake apology when it blows up in your face. You wanted this moment? Congratulations. You got it." The audience was leaning forward in stunned silence. Samuel L. Jackson wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. Every word, every glance carried the weight of someone who knew exactly how much power he held in that moment. "You thought you could use me for entertainment value," Jackson continued, his voice low but searing. "You thought you could turn me into your morning headline. But here's the thing, George. Some of us aren't afraid to push back when we're disrespected." Stephanopoulos opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, the man who always had the last word was utterly speechless. Jackson leaned back, crossing his arms. "Go ahead, ask your next question. Let's see if you've got anything left." But George didn't move. He just sat there, frozen, as the cameras continued to roll. The silence in the studio was deafening. George Stephanopoulos sat frozen, his usual poise shattered. The audience could see it. The power dynamic had completely flipped. Samuel L. Jackson was no longer the guest. He was in command. Jackson slowly leaned forward, his eyes locked on George. "You know what the real tragedy is, George?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with razor-sharp authority. "You had a chance, an opportunity to have a real conversation with me about my work, about the craft I've dedicated my life to, and instead you chose this cheap ambush. For ratings." George opened his mouth, but Jackson held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "No, you don't get to talk now." Jackson's voice carried the weight of absolute control. "You've been sitting behind that desk for years, thinking you can twist people's words without consequences. But let me make something crystal clear. Your platform doesn't give you power over me. It never did." The audience erupted in murmurs, the tension spilling over. Crew members shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were filming one of the most explosive moments in morning show history. "You want to talk about temperament?" Jackson continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. "Temperament isn't about smiling through lies and manipulation. It's about standing your ground when someone tries to disrespect you. And guess what, George? You picked the wrong guy to try this with." George tried one last desperate attempt at damage control. "Samuel, I never meant to ambush you." Jackson stood up. The shift in energy was instant. As he rose to his full height, the entire studio seemed smaller, the lights dimmer compared to his commanding presence. The cameras followed his every move as he towered over the anchor desk. "Intentions don't matter," Jackson said, his voice now low but terrifyingly controlled. "Actions matter. And your actions today have shown the entire world exactly who you are." George sank slightly into his chair, visibly shrinking under the intensity of the moment. The confident anchor, the man who prided himself on controlling the narrative, now looked like a student being scolded by a principal. Jackson unclipped his microphone with deliberate slowness, the small motion carrying enormous symbolic weight. The audience audibly gasped. It was clear he was done. "I'll be promoting my film somewhere else," Jackson said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the studio. "Somewhere that still understands the difference between journalism and cheap ambush tactics." George tried again, his voice cracking. "Samuel, please, let's just—" Jackson turned back, silencing him with nothing more than a piercing stare. "You thought you could control this narrative," Jackson said, his voice rising just enough to echo through the room. "But what you just did, what the entire country just watched, is you losing control completely." The audience was stunned. Some sat with their hands over their mouths. Others whispered to each other in disbelief. Jackson took one final step toward the edge of the stage, the cameras following him as if magnetized. He turned back, eyes locked on George. "Next time you want to question someone's temperament," Jackson said, each word deliberate and devastating, "make sure you can handle it when they show you exactly what real temperament looks like." The studio was dead silent. The studio felt frozen in time. Samuel L. Jackson stood tall at the edge of the stage, his presence so commanding that no one dared to move. Every eye, crew, audience, even the stunned co-anchors off camera, was locked on him. George Stephanopoulos sat motionless at his desk, shoulders hunched, his polished confidence reduced to rubble. The man who had entered the interview thinking he could trap Jackson was now visibly defeated. Jackson's gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on the cameras capturing every second of the confrontation. "You all saw it," he said, his voice calm yet thunderous in its weight. "This wasn't an interview. This was a setup, and it backfired." The audience, who had been silent for so long, began to murmur, some nodding in agreement, others still processing the surreal moment unfolding before them. "You see, George," Jackson continued, his voice steady, "respect is a two-way street. You give it, you get it. You take it away." He gestured around the studio, the energy electric. "And this is what happens." Stephanopoulos tried once more to salvage the situation. "Samuel, let's not end it like this. We can—" Jackson turned back sharply, cutting him off with nothing more than a single raised hand. "No, George, you had your chance. You chose arrogance. You chose ratings over respect. And now you get to live with the consequences. Live in front of millions of people." The cameras captured George's pale face, the beads of sweat on his forehead betraying just how badly the situation had slipped out of his control. Jackson unclipped his microphone completely and placed it on the desk in front of George. A small gesture, but one that felt monumental. "I'll take my work to someone who knows how to have a real conversation," Jackson said, his tone final, unshakable. "And as for you, George, maybe next time, think twice before you underestimate the wrong man." With that, Jackson turned and began walking off stage. Every step echoed through the silent studio, the kind of silence that felt heavy, unforgettable. Just before exiting, Jackson paused one last time, glancing over his shoulder. "Oh, and George," he said, his voice low but cutting through the silence like a blade. "Next time you try to ambush someone, make sure you're ready for them to fight back." He walked out, leaving behind a humiliated host, a stunned audience, and a studio that felt like it had just witnessed a career-defining moment, just not for the man who thought he was in control. The cameras lingered on George Stephanopoulos, sitting alone at his desk, staring at the empty chair across from him. The confident morning show anchor now looked small, exposed, and utterly powerless. The red light on the camera stayed on, broadcasting the most unfiltered, disastrous interview of his career to millions of viewers across the country. It was the kind of moment that would be replayed endlessly online, discussed for years to come. A reminder that some people are simply untouchable when it comes to commanding respect. Samuel L. Jackson had walked in as a guest. He walked out as the man who just dismantled George Stephanopoulos on live television.